I find this fascinating that the president still, and he's been saying this all along, he wants his story out there. He has nothing to hide. He tweets it, he says it, but this is also a president when he wants something, he tends to get it. He doesn't listen to his advisors. So does he really want to testify, or does he want to seem like he doesn't have anything to hide?
I think it's really the latter, right? The optics and the PR element of this is really important. You have to consider that the White House has just spent the past couple of weeks parsing the president's own words. Remember, when he was standing next to Vladimir Putin, it was would versus wouldn't, or parsing those words there. Yesterday, you heard Giuliani saying, oh, it was should, not must. So you can see a scenario in which there is a lot of concern about the president sitting down with Robert Mueller in that kind of high-stakes investigation and saying something that he shouldn't, or saying something that they would have to clarify later. You can see exactly why most legal experts, including the president's own team, don't really want that to happen.
So, Glenn, on the other side, at least they're still talking. What is it that Robert Mueller wants from the president that he can't really get any other way than sitting down face-to-face with him?
So, Chris, at first when I heard that Bob Mueller might be willing to either, reduce the scope of the questions he wants to ask the president or even propose them in writing, I thought, that doesn't sound like the Bob Mueller I worked for and I know. But the more I thought about it, I think he may have concluded that it's in his tactical interest to, for example, offer some written questions to the president. And here's why. Let's assume that one of the written questions to the president is, did you ask Director Comey to lay off Mike Flynn? There are only two answers to that. If the president answers no, Bob Mueller may very well be able to prove that's a lie, and the president has just earned himself a crime, false statement, as part of a federal investigation that could earn him up to 5 years. But what if he says, yes, I did? That could be evidence that he committed obstruction of justice.
So you're arguing, Glenn, that even though a face-to-face may be preferable and all, we've all heard all the stories about how, they could trap him, it's not necessarily necessary.
It's not, and I have a feeling if Mueller decides to put these questions in writing and he pushes that sheet of paper across the table figuratively to the defense, they may look at it, they may push it right back and say, you know what, we'll take a pass.
So, Ned, the president obviously wants this investigation to end. Republicans, as we're hearing from Garrett Haake, want this investigation to end. But is there any way you see it ending without the president of the United States giving his input, whether it's in writing or in a face-to-face interview?
Well, you touched on the irony here, Chris, and that's that President Trump says he wants this to end. His allies in Congress say they want this to end. But the one thing standing in between this ending and it not is the president's participation, at least in this obstruction of justice element of the inquiry. But, there's another detail in this that I think we're overlooking. The White House is portraying this as a choice. Should the president participate in this interview or should he not? Chris, were you lamentably to be the witness or a target of a federal investigation, we would have two choices. We could talk to federal investigators if they wanted to talk to us, or we could invoke our Fifth Amendment rights. We do not hear that coming from this White House. They are portraying this as, maybe the president will cooperate if he feels like it. If we don't feel like it, maybe he won't. That is not an option that you or I would have. It is not consistent with the principle of no man is above the law, and yet that is what we are hearing from the president's advisors.
Yeah, and what we heard all day from the president's lawyers yesterday was the argument that when he was tweeting about Jeff Sessions, it was just an opinion and that the investigation should end again. I don't know, Caitlin, did anything they say make any sense? Did they make their case?
The fact that they had to parse the president's own words several times yesterday, I think, speaks volumes. It also is important against the backdrop of reporting from the New York Times that Robert Mueller is looking at the president's tweets in this body of evidence and documents in terms of this investigation. The president is obviously upset with Jeff Sessions. He's made that known over the past several months. This was the first real directive. Of course, Rod Rosenstein is in charge of this investigation. The question is always...
And Jeff Sessions almost seems to be used to it, right? He's almost kind of, I don't want to say he's baiting him, he's not, but he's sort of trying in a vague way to respond.
Yes.
And doesn't seem really upset about it.
When you look at his public comments and behavior, when you look at Rod Rosenstein's public comments and behavior, they're really telling in terms of the confidence that they have in this investigation, even as the president tries to denigrate them and his entire Justice Department, really. You can kind of see where they stand on this.
So denigrating his entire Justice Department, but also, yet again, putting his communications team in a situation where they have to, frankly, contradict what has been said in the past. I want to play what Sean Spicer said way back when about the presidential tweets last year, and then Sarah Sanders just yesterday.
Are President Trump's tweets considered official White House statements?
Well, the president is the president of the United States, so they're considered official statements by the president of the United States.
Does that tweet this morning mark a change in posture by the president?
It's not an order. It's the president's opinion.
And then, Glenn, you have Rudy Giuliani saying the president used the word should, not must, as we pointed out. Legally speaking, does the president's tweet carry any weight when it comes to the question of obstruction of justice?
Yeah, Chris, let me tell you how the rules of evidence would apply to the president's tweets. There's a rule called statement of party opponents, and all that is that when we have a defendant in court, anything that defendant said, anything he wrote, anything he tweeted is considered his statement that the prosecutors can introduce as evidence against him. And whether Sarah Huckabee Sanders tries to walk it back or Mr. Giuliani tries to walk it back, guess what? Those walkbacks are not admissible in a court of law, but the president's tweets are, and they are telling when he says things like, you know, AG Sessions should stop this witch hunt. That sure sounds pretty direct to me.
Ned, do you think the president undermined his own case by going after Sessions yesterday?
Well, he's undermined his own case all along. He's undermined his case, and he's also once again underscored his ignorance of the whole process, going after Jeff Sessions, who is recused from this matter. But look, President Trump has a strategy that he has followed since the onset of this probe, and that seems to be to get ahead of where this is going. It seems to be a strategy of trying to proactively discredit Bob Mueller, to try to proactively discredit Bob Mueller's team, knowing that this team is working on a report that most likely will be submitted to Congress, at which point Congress will have to render a verdict in terms of if they pursue impeachment proceedings or not. What President Trump seems to be doing with all of this, by going after Jeff Sessions, by going after Rod Rosenstein, by going after Andy McCabe, by going after Bob Mueller, by going after anyone else who has touched this ongoing criminal probe, is to try to make this into an empty vessel before it's even completed, so that when it is presented to President Trump's allies in Congress, they will just shrug it off. They will say this is the work of Bob Mueller and his 13 angry Democrats, quote unquote. And you know what? Unfortunately, it seems to be working. If you look at how congressional Republicans have responded to these threats with a shrug, that is exactly what President Trump has sought all along.
Let me ask you really quickly, Caitlin. We also heard Rudy Giuliani. I don't want to leave this out, say yesterday, this election is going to be about impeachment or no impeachment. Is he right?
Well, Republicans are talking a lot about impeachment in congressional races as kind of a boogeyman of sorts, warning their base that if Democrats take over the House, they're going to move to impeach the president. You've also heard Garrett mention Republicans on Capitol Hill want to get this wrapped up quickly because they don't want it to be an issue. I've talked to Republican campaigns and candidates who are running in this cycle who are echoing the president's own words, evoking the idea that this is a witch hunt. And they think that this kind of rallies their base, that they see themselves as kind of in this fight with the president against these powers, they say, that are trying to defy him and his agenda. So the president, I think Ned brings up a great point, which is that this is all part of the PR strategy, the strategy to sway public opinion, especially heading into a midterm election.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.